goal setting, monitoring, and evaluation. Three very important topics for a club leader. Execution is more difficult than strategy. And of course, what that means is that many organizations, including golf facilities, have strategy and they have a strategic plan. However, years go by and it's never executed. So execution involves specific goal setting, monitoring these goals, and then evaluating on an ongoing basis the performance to the goals. So let's start with goal setting. The first principle of goal setting is that there is alignment, that the members, board, GMCO, management, team, and staff are all aligned on the goals, and the goals are actually strategy-based. Secondly, that there's agreement, and agreement means that management particularly has to sign off that it actually is achievable. And the reason I put dues-based budget in brackets is that it's my experience that many clubs that are member-owned want the dues to be as low as possible, or they want the dues increase to be a minimum. However, then the organization sets rather ambitious goals based on the strategic plan that in essence are not achievable because the dues-based budget doesn't reflect the cost of actually the resources required to meet the goal. So the second agreement is by whom, when, and where. And these would seem to be obvious, however, they're not. There needs to be agreement who's doing what. And in some cases, in some clubs, there's a board, there's committees, and there's management and staff. In some cases, it's just a single owner and the management. However, it needs to be agreed who's doing what, when it'll happen. As you know, golf in Canada particularly is a seasonal activity, so it's very important to specify even when, because sometimes to accomplish a goal that's based on strategy can be disruptive. And of course, where is more obvious if it's in the clubhouse, on the course, or whatever. One thing to avoid in goal setting is moving goalposts and undefined targets. By moving goalposts, we mean that by the end of June, you're 30% ahead on your green fee budget, so it's decided to change the goal. No, don't change the goal, just report more positive results at year end. Changing the goals is not advised because the goal has a whole many factors included below the goal. And if you modify the goal without modifying those other factors, then you get chaos. And undefined targets are things like membership satisfaction. Very difficult to define. So avoid goals that don't have objective criteria to them. Finally, make sure that the person you assign the goal to has the appropriate authority. And this particularly applies to general managers. A responsibility without authority defeats accountability. In other words, how can you hold somebody accountable if they don't have the authority to accomplish the goal? So what would be the board's role in goal setting? Well, it's first of all to determine the strategies, major goals, and outcomes. In board-led organizations, the board is responsible for policy and strategy. And it's to ensure that there is a strategic plan. And the board then determines from the strategic plan major goals or outcomes for the upcoming year. Another role of the board is to set appropriate limits for the GM. The GM should have limits as to what he or she can do to accomplish the goal. Or again, you may accomplish the goal and without limits do something inappropriate or something that was not allowed, not contractual, all those other kinds of things. The other role of the board is to actually provide the authority, flexibility, and most importantly, the resources to the person who's given the goal. In this case, I'm using the GM/COO. It could be another different title, but it's the operational leader of the club that we're generally talking about in this course. And finally, specify objective results. They need to be objective. Subjective results do not help organizations. Finally, the board, well, I guess second to finally, the board should monitor its own performance and hold itself accountable. Some of the organizational goals are going to be board goals that apply to the board and its committees. So the board should monitor its own performance and hold itself accountable. The board should ensure that there's not operational churn. And operational churn is a term that I invented that means something going to management and then to a committee and then to the board, and nobody makes a decision, so it goes back and churns around. It goes management, committee, board, and months go by and nothing happens. The board's role is to step in and say, no, we're the decision-making authority. We're going to make a decision to avoid this ever-churning decision. What then would be the GM/COO's role in goal setting? Well, first of all, it's better to be reminded than instructed. In other words, once the goal is set and the parameters or limits are put around it, then it's the GM's job to then accomplish the goal. And it's fine for the board to periodically remind the general manager of this, but boards shouldn't set goals and then give specific instructions later as to how they'll be accomplished, because that removes all accountability from the general manager. If you're being told what the goal is and then how to do it, and if it isn't achieved, well, then you can just say, well, that's because the board interfered and told me exactly what to do and how to achieve the goal. Manage up, that's self-explanatory. One of the skills that you need to develop if you're going to lead a board-led organization is the ability to manage up, to be a servant leader of the board, but be a leader nevertheless. It's important to report what will not be done. In other words, avoid all these complex things and making people believe that everything else that's normally done will be done, and you're adding these goals onto the top of it. Something usually has to give, and it's very, very important to be clear at the beginning that to accomplish this goal, this other activity will be either lessened or not done. Clarify the expectation that there's also a business to run. Some goals are very, very disruptive to business. Renovating the clubhouse, renovating the golf course, other sorts of things that can interrupt the business. And make sure that you are clear what the impact is. Then set the monitoring process. Some things are best reported monthly, some are best reported quarterly, some are best reported annually. So set the monitoring process and say, here's when we're going to monitor this goal. Here's how frequently we're going to do it, and here's in what format it's going to be. And here's where a lot of people use scorecards, dashboards, and KPIs. Scorecards and dashboards are tables or Excel spreadsheets that get populated with data that shows what's happening. It's far better than an extremely long, wordy document. It's visual, it's easy to produce, and it creates a great snapshot as to where you are in accomplishing a goal. On the dashboard or scorecard, use trend lines. In other words, lead and lag indicators are, this is a lead indicator. We're in June, but this is the way it's trending, and make mention of that. A lag indicator would be, we're in June, but we won't know the results for this until August. But nevertheless, I want to make a point of that. And finally, in order to accomplish these goals, you have to have the ability, obviously, to manage down. Nothing really happens at a golf facility that isn't done effectively by management and staff. Monitoring. If you recall in the earlier module, we talked about the board policy manual, or the BPM. This is where it becomes vital that it's in the board policy manual. It's in the BPM. And the strategic plan and current year goals are often appendices to the strategic plan, to the board policy manual, so that the board each year updates the board policy manual by updating the strategic plan and the current year goals. The monitoring of performance of the club is always against written goals. There's not anecdotal goals or verbal goals or all those other kinds of things. And making them written means that they're clear and that they're done hopefully at the beginning of the term. Monitoring should be as automatic as possible. With technology, that's very easily done. The software generates the numbers, and then manager and his team, his or her team, just have to add commentary, and then you've got the report done. And then if the software is told that we want this quarterly, then it produces it quarterly. There should also be a specification for an annual performance review policy with specified process and timing. This is critical for the person being evaluated, obviously, that this should occur each year. Now, the days of the performance review annually where you didn't know what you were going to hear, they're pretty well over because you're going to monitor as you go through the year. Nevertheless, it's very important for the board to tell their only employee where he or she stands, and that person has an opportunity to comment on the evaluation. And most times there's some monetary or things to go along with that. So what are some of the solutions? Well, a clear reporting policy, proper process, and data. Keeping a compelling scorecard. What we mean there is don't keep things that are meaningless. The number of teas sold or other sorts of things, the number of cups of coffee or whatever. Make it things that people want to know how things are. Compelling scorecard are things you know that people are very valuable and very important and very indicative of the process and the performance. Create a cadence of accountability. This means it should become part of the organization that we look at these numbers on these times and these dates, and it's throughout the organization. It's just not the board and the GM who have this monitoring process and monitoring policy and things. It should be GM, department heads, staff, board, everybody into a goal-setting monitoring system, because it does create accountability. And if you remember at the very beginning, we talked about execution. Execution is generally a function of accountability. Valid and relevant data, preferably with benchmarks aligned with strategy. Data-driven decision making is a big thing now, but the data should be with benchmarks. In other words, if your score for member satisfaction is 3.9 out of a survey, and it was 3.6, and everybody's patting you on the back, and isn't that wonderful? Well, better check with your comparative set. And a comparative set are the clubs that are like yours or similar to yours. And check with your competitive set, which are the clubs you actually compete with in your market. If the competitive and comparative set are at 4.3, then your growth from 3.6 to 3.9 is somewhat meaningless. The GM evaluation. In summary, it's in the board policy manual, it's in writing, and it's adopted. There are no surprises for either party in this process. There's continuity and succession. Should he or she leave, the new person comes in, the goals aren't thrown out the door because there's a new person. There's continuity, and there's an allowance for succession planning. It's in place before the first board meeting. I recommend that all clubs, regardless if they have it facilitated or not, have a board retreat and an orientation right after the annual meeting and the election, and set these goals early and get them in place. That way you have 11.5 months to get them done. Make sure the GM evaluation is mutually beneficial. In other words, the feedback given goes two ways. The board gives feedback to the general manager on his or her performance based on goals and monitoring. The GM then gives feedback to the board and perhaps the committees that this was accomplished with your help and thank you. This could be accomplished better if we did things slightly differently.